So she was out of acute for a year.
Till she was 18, because the youngest that you could start your nursing training was age 18.
Which is the age that Mary Morris is when she comes to England from Ireland to start her training.
What she really wanted to do, your grandmother, was train at the Nightingale School of Nursing.
At St Thomas's in London.
Because that was like the...
Which I mentioned in one of the Victober videos. I mentioned Florence Nightingale setting that up in about 1856, 57, I want to say.
She wanted to go there because she saw that as like the best, you know, the ultimate place to study nursing. But they wouldn't pay you till you were 21. And there was no way she felt that she could carry on living at home, living off her parents who were, you know, the depression of the war. So she needed to do a nursing training, and the one that you could do that was paid and was enough to, because like the Nightingale School assumed that you were like posh enough to more or less support yourself, and that you'd be able to buy your own uniform and pay, you know, and all of that. And she didn't have that money, so she also needed to be able to save over those weeks. So she needed to be able to keep herself in London and learn something useful and save enough money so that she'd actually be able to do the Nightingale training.
Which is what she wanted to do.
So the thing she chose to do was fever nursing. People will think, what on earth is that?
Yes.
Because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yes. What is fever nursing?
But fever nursing was huge then.
Because this is obviously the days before antibiotics. Penicillin, was it the early 1940s, 1941?
While she was working, they started to introduce the very first sort of
penicillin drugs.
This was 1939 or 1938. Gosh, I can't count. 37, 38, around
that
then.
kind of time.
Yeah.
So yes, there weren't antibiotics. There weren't any really effective anti-infection medications at all, and there weren't really effective vaccine programs. So in England we have the National Health Service, but that was set up in 1946, or as a response to World War II.
Yes, sort of vaccination programs didn't happen until again after.
And there had been some vaccinations, and I think I know because when I was reading about the Victorians, they was talking about maybe smallpox might have had a vaccination program.
Yes. So no antibiotics. So the thing that huge numbers of people died of then was infectious diseases, and including like all the things that we think of now as really minor childhood diseases or things that we vaccinate against, like measles and mumps and rubella and diphtheria, scarlet fever. All of those were like huge
and massive killers. We should whisk this,
which means we'll have to stop talking.
And stop talking while we do it. So I'm just using the electric beater, and I'm going to whisk this until you can see it's all dark sugar and margarine. It'll look quite light at the end of it, weirdly.
And it takes quite a while, but
it does take a long time.
Magically it will be done.
Been whisking for a little while, and we now have this instead.
Lovely.
And
kind of looks like fudge, doesn't it?
It does. It probably kind of tastes like fudge as well.
Nice.
So now we are beating the eggs into the butter and the sugar. And the recipe calls for 5 large eggs, but because these are free-range eggs, they're very unequal sizes, so we've picked out 6 small eggs instead. And you were saying about Grandma being in the fever hospital, which actually is what Mary Morris did as well, but she did it the other way around. So she went and did her training to become an SRN, a state registered nurse, and then she left that hospital once she'd gained her certificate and her registration, and she went to a fever hospital in Woolwich. So Grandma's fever hospital was in
like sort of the Lambeth area, so a little bit. I mean, there were quite a few of them. And
because it was such a big problem. So Woolwich is more towards the east end of London.
And hers was more in the centre.
Mary Morris talks about, I should start just calling her Mary because it's a bit odd saying Mary Morris every time. So Mary talks about being having to go on ambulance duty as well and go to pick up sort of reported fever cases. And she's doing this in sort of 1941 or 42, I want to say. So it's the middle of the Blitz as well. Wow. So they're driving in ambulances and sort of being called to stop to go to sort of bomb sites effectively or events that have happened due to the bombing, as well as going to pick up families, generally of children with fevers, in sort of tenement housing. And you were saying that Grandma had similar, not during the Blitz, but having to go out to
37, 38, 39, so the sort of 3 years running up to the war. And going out and picking the children up and coming from like a kind of like rural area and going and picking these children with infections up. One thing that is worth saying is that if you had an infectious disease, if you had like mumps or whatever, and you were well off, you were nursed at home. It was only like the poorer children that went to the fever hospitals so that they could be properly cared for. So she was so shocked.
Yeah, at the conditions that people were
living in at the end of the 1930s in London. Just appalling.
And this was, I don't know what Grandma's hospital would have been, but Mary's hospital is a voluntary service hospital, so all of the doctors were actually working free of charge due to the need that there was, and they earned their income working with private patients who were able to be nursed at home, and sort of dedicated their time and experience to these fever hospitals because it was so essential.
Absolutely. But in fact, one of the things that my mother said was that one of the enjoyable things in a way about fever nursing is that most of what was done to help children survive those diseases was the nursing care. That was the thing that made the difference, because there were no effective sort of drugs to use or anything like that. So it was like, really careful diet and really careful care that mattered. And
she talks about sort of having to change people's bed sheets 5 times in a row because they were sweating so much and needing to keep them sort of cool and fresh.
So all that keeping things to keep their sort of temperature down, lots of it was done by like bathing them, and it was very sort of intensive personal care that helped those children pull through. Yeah.
And Mary was working with children, and she's talking about children sort of being in oxygen tents, and even having a patient in an iron lung, which they use for polio, which is...
Yes.
I mean, these days we have mechanical ventilators and we put a tube in through the mouth, but the iron lung was like the first ventilator, wasn't it? And it sucked your chest up and down effectively in order to suck air into your chest.
Yeah.
It's incredible, and the lives that it will have saved.
Can we go for it with the eggs?
So I'm beating in 2 eggs at first, and then I'll beat in more as we go along. So some of Mary's experiences relate to working in a civilian hospital in wartime. So they were very, very short-staffed, and I don't know whether short-staffing was an issue in the 30s. It seems to be a bit of a perennial health service problem.
Yes.
And just every problem that they had was blamed on the fact that it was the war, which I think nowadays you'd probably say, it's due to austerity. But yes. She must have been about 20 years old by this point, looking after 32 sick children by herself. Yeah. And there's one particular case that she talks about where a child is deteriorating and they have to have an emergency tracheostomy overnight, so they have to have an operation to make a hole in their neck in order to breathe. Yes. And it's just her and a surgeon on the table in the middle of the ward, and they make this tracheostomy, and then they put the child back to bed, and she carries on looking after the 30 other children in the ward. Yeah. Which is just, it's incredible compared to the care that you would have today following a tracheostomy. But it's really interesting to compare how healthcare has changed since the 1940s and the good situation that we have now compared to then.
I'll give you 1 spoonful of this.
So sometimes putting a little bit of flour in, if it starts to sort of curdle slightly with the eggs, which it shouldn't do if the eggs are room temperature.
It shouldn't do, and they are, but nevertheless 1 spoonful is always a good plan.
Kind of keeps it. So you were saying earlier about antibiotics.
It was like a very early version that they were almost like experimenting with, and they were like almost like showing that it worked.
The proof of the idea.
Yeah.
And obviously in the 1940s, all of the penicillin stocks, they didn't have any mass production systems, so they were all sent to the soldiers at the front because of shrapnel wounds and things that needed preventative antibiotics. So she talks about this drug called B&M 639, which was supposed to reduce infections, but it wasn't obviously as effective as antibiotics. So yes, nursing these people with things like diphtheria with absolutely nothing other than, like you said, good nursing care.
Good nursing care.
And just sort of waiting and hoping to see whether things would work and whether somebody would pull through or not.
That looks wonderful.
So that's all the whisking done. From now on we can kind of use a spoon, can't we?
Yeah.
So Grandma was in the fever hospital for about 2 years, was she? 3 years?
And qualified as a fever nurse. And the hospital was actually run by, kind of belonged to the city council, in effect, like the London Corporation.
Actually, I think that might be true about the Woolwich Hospital as well.
That's
and
it.
The voluntary one was the other one. I don't know, but yes.
Because it was almost like a public health thing. So although most healthcare was like private, but there were charitable and voluntary hospitals, and like the big hospitals like Thomas's that were they were all religious, and then they became like sort of charitable foundations or people supported them, and then there were ones that were run almost like municipal ones, and they tended to focus on things that were almost like public health, so like fever, like if they didn't take them and care for them, then it would spread across the whole population, and so.
And they were sort of learning from the mistakes of the past, weren't they? Because in the Victorian era, they had suddenly these big cities filled with people, not very good conditions, huge outbreaks of things like cholera and typhoid and so on. So they were sort of learning from that they needed to keep people that had infections away from other patients.
Because what people did understand by then was how infections spread.
Yes, so they'd started to work out, they could actually see bacteria and they could work out which bacteria cause which things.
Yeah, and so there was like a huge emphasis on infection control. In like they did, so barrier nursing is what they used to call it, which you must still do.
Yes, definitely. If you're working with a patient with an infection, it's still, the ground rules are washing your hands, wearing gloves and apron, just preventing any kind of contact really, and preventing the spread.
And that when you leave them, you take...
Yeah, keep the doors closed, things like that.
Take those things off, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they were doing it in big wards, but they did have isolation rooms.
When they needed to.
When they needed them.
But then I also, especially talks about being on the diphtheria wards, they had a whole cohort of patients with diphtheria, so I guess there was less cross-contamination concern.
Yes, and they needed to be in a big ward, because then if you were the one person looking after 30 children, you needed to be able to see all of them.
Yeah, and see everything.
So the wards were designed like that.
Yeah, and is that called a Nightingale
It's
ward?
called the Nightingale. It's back to Florence.
She
designed it like that.
So a huge ward that you could see everyone, because Florence Nightingale was very big on this idea of like the constant monitoring and being able to just walk around and look at all of your patients at once. Now
we're thinking about this, but simultaneously, we need to show them how yummy that looks. We won't let it escape, but it looks so delicious.
It's so glossy
and gorgeous.